I think I've got the ping. Everybody else got the ping too. Well, it's a real privilege to be here with you this evening, and I'm very grateful to Vajrachaksu for inviting me. It's not often I get an opportunity to just reflect on why I'm doing what I'm doing. And yes, Vajrachaksu is right. It's a little bit of a surprise to find myself here. I'll tell you in a little while what I've got planned for this evening, but let me just take you back nearly 4 years ago. So it's the 31st of October 2018, and I'm in London, and I'm just outside the Houses of Parliament. Some of you will know the images of the English UK Houses of Parliament quite well, with Big Ben and so forth. And I'm actually sitting in the road just outside these Houses of Parliament with 300 other people blocking traffic, and I'm surrounded by police. And I am indeed very surprised to find myself there. I'm somewhat in a state of shock, and I'm asking myself, what on earth am I doing? Because I've never ever done anything like that before, and it may or may not be rather obvious to you, but I'm a rather sort of kind of a conservative with a small c guy who's been brought up to do what he's told and certainly not say boo to the police. So, you know, when being invited to move and not doing so, this was going very much against the grain. However, I seem to have developed a little bit of an appetite for this kind of thing, and I've been arrested for similar kinds of acts now 12 times. And the immediate consequences of that was most recently, I started yesterday an 8-week, 2-year suspended custodial sentence, which means that if I get arrested sometime in the next 2 years, I'll go to prison for 8 weeks. And I've just also, as part of the same sentence, started to work off 240 hours of community payback. So the judge obviously decided to throw the book at me on this occasion. And this was for the pleasure of blocking the port of Dover for a day. I'm also obviously have a criminal record, but I'm also being pursued by the National Highways Company, which runs the major roads around the UK, for substantial civil expenses. So that, you know, there have been some consequences to this rashness on my part. So why have I chosen to go down this road? I'm not at first sight the most obvious person to be breaking the law, to be engaging in civil disobedience, or sometimes it's called non-violent direct action. After all, Buddhism has been my touchstone for, well, 40 odd years now. And I got involved with the FWBO or as it used to be called, the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, and now the Triratna, 25 years ago. And I spent a long period of time just being fully involved, living and working within the central institutions of Triratna. And then I spent 12 years as a psychotherapist, mainly teaching secular mindfulness. So yes, all of that's not really the most obvious background for an activist, so it's not surprising that Vajrachaksu might have been a little bit surprised to encounter me in this mode. But about 4 years ago, I decided to retire, and I cast around what to do next. And with a bit more time on my hands, I was struck by the urgency of the climate crisis. And I had a very strong, apparently quite common activist gut feeling at the time on learning the facts of the situation that it's just not okay. It really is not okay. I can't stand by and do nothing. So in my case, just very much just a moral imperative, an entirely personal act, something that I feel quite deeply in, as it were, the core of myself. And it is, as Vajrachaksu says, it's a prompting of my conscience. For better or worse, I don't feel that, you know, however sensible some people might think what I've been doing is, I don't feel I can really do very much else other than that. So probation officer 4 days ago asked me whether I was going to do this all over again, and there was a long pause, and then I said, well, of course, you know, what else? What else do you think I did what I did in the first place? So there you go. But 4 years ago, I decided to get involved with Extinction Rebellion, and I also stood for election as a town councillor. But much more recently, I've been involved in 2 further direct action campaigns, one called Insulate Britain, and an even more recent one called Just Stop Oil. And you can easily look these up online if you're interested to hear a bit more. Nevertheless, despite all of this activity, and I have spent an awful lot of my time involved with these groups, it's very easy to fall into feeling hopeless and helpless, and just to be sort of dithering, not knowing really what I'm doing or why I'm doing what I'm doing. And it's also very easy to get trapped into being attached to outcomes and feeling ineffective or effective, depending on what it is I've been up to. And it is a practice to just try and work with not knowing, and the doubts that come. And in particular, there's a doubt around, is this really a genuine living out of the Buddhist precepts, particularly the first and second precepts? In other words, civil disobedience involves thwarting another person's volition and also taking the not given in terms of their time and energy. So this evening, what I would like to do is I'd hope to share with you why I've gone down this particular road in the last 4 years and intend to keep going, and in what way I draw on my commitment to Buddhist practice to support this. I'm very much aware that I'm talking to some of you who English is not your first language, and so if I'm talking a little bit too quickly or I say something you don't understand, please do just jump in and say, can you make that a bit clearer? Or and I have to apologize somewhat for the rather English-centric nature of the examples, but I'm afraid that's just the world that I'm revolving in at the moment. So at the same time, this is what I'm going to share with you is not a sales pitch. I'm not here this evening to try and convince you to follow me down the same path. But I do hope to share with you how I see Buddhist practice as a moral ground on which we each make decisions, both personally and how that affects us, the impact that we have collectively on the climate and ecological crisis, as I call it. And I also hope to provide a brief overview or pointers towards a variety of options that you might wish to consider as a way forward to taking your next step. So first of all, I'm just going to spend a chunk of time just talking about really quite basic Buddhist practice as I see it. And then I'm going to spend a little bit more time exploring what we mean by activism and share with you a particular example in the Buddhist activist tradition, the Greystone Foundation in New York, which I find personally very inspiring. And then I'll finish up with just sharing with you some of the conundrums that I've experienced as a practicing Buddhist in terms of non-violent civil disobedience and direct action. So the question is, how is practicing Buddhism relevant to being an activist, if at all? And from where I'm standing, the short answer is a lot. My interpretation rests on a Buddhist teacher called Stephen Batchelor, and obviously my original teacher, Sangharakshita. But of course, this is my interpretation, what I'm sharing with you. But I do draw heavily on both of those men. So first of all, it almost goes without saying, but Buddhist practice starts with awareness, or what very often is called mindfulness, because mindfulness has become a very big thing in the last 20 odd years or so. But it doesn't just mean paying attention or being with or awake or alive to what's happening in the immediate moment. Crucial as that is, of course, and integral to practicing mindfulness as is. Within Buddhism, there are 3 key terms. I'm not going to explore these, but there's sati, sampradanya, and appamada. And these draw out the what, the how, and the why of practicing mindfulness. And one of the connotations which I was intrigued to read was that one of these terms, appamada, can be associated with the term care, or acting with care, fully with care, or caringly. So all of these, when you think about it, you know, when you're being mindful, yes, you want to make sure that you don't drop something. So you're being careful, for example, but more generally speaking, there's a sense in which one cares to act with awareness. It makes a difference. And so there's a sense in which there is a sort of an implication of being conscientious in one's practice of paying attention. So the climate and ecological crisis is, how is that relevant? Well, there's a willingness to look, to listen, to learn the facts, and to face the truth, and to wake up to it, to acknowledge it, and to allow it to be there, to investigate, explore, and inquire into it. And that's far from easy, as I'll come to in a moment. It sounds quite simple and straightforward, but just even, you know, just becoming aware of the basic facts of what is happening is very, very challenging. I'm not going to spend very much time on the science. I'm sure that there are lots of very much more qualified and better speakers to fill you in on all the different aspects of that. But briefly, the climate and ecological crisis, as we could call it, is a series of interlocking crises that encompass a whole range of physical, biological, ecological, and human dimensions, which range from the nature of the impact of human activity on the climate and the oceans and ecosystems, but also that impact on the poorest of humanity, especially in the global south. And the most obvious examples of this happening as we speak, as we are here, are heat waves, floods, food shortages, and migration. And part of this practice of becoming aware, just aware of what all of that is allowing ourselves to really feel how shocking that truth is. It's very, very challenging to stay with all of that, and it takes courage to take it in. And personally, I find that I can only do that in small bites. You know, it's just you know, only so much of that stuff that you can stomach at any one time, because it is very easily to get overwhelmed by it. But another part of this practice, which of being aware is, I would like to suggest, is bearing witness to the truth. It's not just simply becoming aware of it, but it's also speaking it, sharing it, communicating it with others. And we have 4 speech precepts which outline truthfulness, kindly speech, helpful speech, and harmonizing speech. So it's quite a lot of guidance on how to best go about doing this. But what this is really about, as I see it, is about being honest with oneself and with other people. It's really talking from what one does know. And, you know, it's very easy to get on one's high horse about these things and start bashing people over the head with, as it were, climate facts, or indeed get into arguments, or, you know, falling out with people. And there's just so many different ways in which we can get tangled up with others. Another aspect of this I'd just like to draw our attention to is what we expose ourselves to in terms of written communication, or you know, these days in terms of digital media, has an enormous influence upon us. And you know, one could probably dwell on this topic for a long time, but it's just really important to bear in mind that it's very easy in this day and age to live in a kind of bubble. I suppose, you know, this might sound a little pejorative, but you know, many of the supporters of Donald Trump seem to live in that kind of world. But it's easy to point the finger when actually I live in an activist world where, we all kind of reinforce each other's views of other groups. So it's important to realize this and to just sort of recognize that in our communications that we take responsibility for what's actually going on. So just another aspect of practicing mindfulness is, and a very important one highlighted by the Buddha, is observing dukkha, as it's called in Buddhist terminology, or to give it an English translation, the unsatisfactoriness that is inherent to life. It's not that life is suffering or unsatisfactory, it's just that life is shot through very often with this quality of unsatisfactoriness. And this is another aspect of bearing witness, as it were, or recognizing what's going on for what it is. And this is actually the first dimension of a fourfold task, as Stephen Batchelor calls it, sometimes alluded to as one of the four truths first taught by the Buddha in his very first teaching. Now, there's a fourfold task in a way. So although we very often talk about these tasks as in a linear fashion, 1, 2, 3, 4, I'd like to suggest that they're actually much more sort of kind of, they link up with each other and feed into each other all the time. So it's more of a cyclical fourfold task rather than four separate tasks which unfold one after the other. So the consequences of becoming more aware, more mindful of what's going on is it sort of very naturally raises a variety of habitual responses. And what I think is integral to the Buddhist teaching is highlighted in the second of this fourfold task, second dimensions or aspects of this fourfold task, which is to let go of these habitual responses. In the first instance, the climate and ecological crisis is frightening. It's just, and it prompts a whole gamut of stress responses. The more we dwell on it, I've already alluded to it, we sort of stimulate what is very often identified in psychological circles as the flight, fight, freeze response. As I've said, we can sometimes get angry or we start arguing with people, or alternatively, we might deny and don't want to look or just insist on not looking at all, just saying there's nothing that can be done. Or we may, which is I think probably even more common, is we just may freeze, we just may go quite numb. And all of these are actually quite legitimate emotions. Feeling overwhelmed, feeling upset or sad or even despairing, degree of hopelessness, as I've just mentioned before, or a sense of paralysis and passivity. All of these are natural reactions of our psychophysical organism and are a fruit of what Paul Gilbert, who's a well-known psychotherapist in the UK, has called the tricky brain that we've evolved with. It's not our fault that we end up feeling these emotions. So the practice is not to fight them, but to acknowledge and to allow and to accept and investigation, explore them. Very often they're quite painful and difficult, but the challenge is not to feed them. And the challenge is also to hold all of that in a kindly, caring, compassionate way, a sort of understanding that it's entirely natural to have these kinds of responses or reactions. And the feeling of helplessness is something that seems to come up again and again for all of us. What can I do that would make a real difference? And of course, it's very hard sometimes to answer that question easily. I just want to remind you of Greta Thunberg, who I assume you probably have heard of. She's become a bit of a star in the last 4 years, but actually only 4 years ago, at the age of just coming up 16, Greta was completely on her own. she decided that she had to do something and she didn't know what to do. And she went and sat down outside the Swedish Parliament with a large banner, which of course has become her motif, which she carries around with her all the time now, striking on Fridays for to try and draw attention. And of course, in that instance, as we all know, if we know the story, it's come to make a huge difference. And what she has said about that experience is, I've learned that you're never too small to make a difference. And I think it's just, it's really important to try and remember that there are all sorts of opportunities that we can take if we are in the right kind of frame of mind. Hopefully we can explore that a little bit more fully later on. But the point I would just like to share with you just now is that, which is one of agency. We can't not act. We're acting all the time. This is a fundamental tenet of Buddhist philosophy, is that we're making choices all the time. Even if it's a choice not to do anything, we're making a choice, and there will be consequences. This is just the law of karma, or karma as it's sometimes called. So we are constantly faced with the challenge of how to act more or less skillfully. And as a consequence, inevitably, more or less wholesome consequences will ensue, which will have near or far-reaching consequences for us or for other people. So when we look into, as with the Buddhist tradition, around the roots of unskillfulness, traditionally, what's said to feed that is the greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the three poisons that are sometimes highlighted. In relation to the climate and ecological emergency, what this, I would suggest, actually boils down to is that at a global level, the human race is living beyond the bounds or boundaries of planetary resources. It's said that we would need at least 3 planets or 3 Earths to satisfy what humankind has set out to try and achieve through its goals. So the practice is one of very much of letting go of our addiction and our deep-rooted attachment, primarily to consumerism and a sense of acquisitiveness. But perhaps a little bit more simply, it's just to the way of living that we have got used to or aspire to that's wholly unsustainable. And of course, this is much more of a challenge, perhaps for us in the so-called developed world, than it is for others who have not been the beneficiary of the huge amount of riches that we have had. But it's also not just a direct kind of equation of letting go of those kind of dreams. It's also letting go of the beliefs and stories that feed that greed and acquisitiveness and that addiction. And one of the most, as it were, pernicious ones is that human happiness and human welfare is tied up with progress that can be measured quite directly through gross domestic product. And this is very much the story of what gets taught in first-year economics at university. It's the kind of basic, kind of fundamental premise of some very influential graphs that get shared. And very often all sorts of different disciplines are, I suppose, educated in this particular approach. And of course, as an assumption, it has huge implications for the way people behave. It's what Charles Eisenstein, and I can give you the references for him, has called the story of domination and extraction from what is assumed to be boundless nature. The economic model is based on the notion that we don't have to measure what we take from nature. We don't have to really apply for it. So water, air, whatever, you know, they're just abundant, and they can be, we can either extract from them or dump stuff into them, and we don't have to pay anything for the privilege of that. It's what Eisenstein calls the story of separation. And at root in Buddhist terminology, this is very much about a dualism of me and mine and myself versus other, where self-interest is of paramount importance and even seen to be the way to actually, if we all act out of self-interest, then everything will come right. So letting go of all of this, which is this second dimension of this fourfold task, is actually really quite frightening and challenging because it has very personal everyday implications. So the average UK carbon footprint needs to be reduced by a factor of 5. So here I am living in what I like to think of as a fairly conscientious way regarding my personal consumption. But nevertheless, I suspect, you know, my carbon footprint is somewhere in the region of 10. I forget the exact mathematics of this, but it's in fact a factor around about 10. I think it's tons of carbon dioxide a year. And I'm told that we need to reduce it to about 2. So there's your factor of 5. To be in line right across the globe, everybody needs to be living somewhere in the region of 2. So an awful lot of people in the global south actually only have a footprint of about 2 anyway. You know, the emphasis is much more on people like me to actually make much bigger changes in my life. And I find that actually quite staggering. I don't know what to do next, as it were. It's quite hard to imagine what I need to be doing. But it's also quite frightening because, well, more than just quite frightening, it's actually very frightening because we're up against massive entrenched systemic forces, principally embodied in the oil industry, in the banks that support them, and associated global corporations and politicians who owe them. So within the activist circles that I've been moving in, it becomes more and more obvious just how strong these forces are that we're up against. But I take some comfort from a quote from Franklin Roosevelt, who was president of the USA in 1933, who said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." I believe this was in relation to him launching a huge plan at the time of the sort of kind of the breakdown in economics in the late 20s. So just moving on now, I have to keep an eye on the time, hoping I'm not running out already. Into the third task. What happens if we manage to let go of, and we manage to see the consequences of unskillful actions so that we're inclined not to repeat those unskillful actions? Well, a space opens up. In traditional Buddhism, this is called living in the gap between, as it were, feelings of one sort or another and whatever choices we make as a consequence of feeling whatever we're feeling. And in freeing ourselves not to react in the ways that I've been talking about, we become free or freer to make more skillful, creative choices with more wholesome consequences. So if we pursue that tendency, what comes is the capacity to savor, as one translation of the Buddha's explanation of this has it, we have the opportunity to savor the stillness and the simplicity and contentment of being truly, truly human, which is another way of thinking of the third precept that we have. And so within the stillness comes a reconnecting to the preciousness and the magic and the beauty and the mysterious uniqueness of life. And a kind of just an understanding, a recognition that life is the greatest good within us and without us. And that there's so many different ways that we can embrace this and celebrate it and delight in it and find that reflected in the life around us on the planet that we're in, comes in multitudinous of myriad different forms, all the wonders of nature and humanity. I'm reminded of that first awesome photograph, I think it was in the late 60s of Earth taken from space, and the description of how people felt when they saw that. But, you know, perhaps at a more kind of mundane level, I try and do this for myself by lying on the ground and watching the swallows and swifts playing in the, well, I mean, I'm not so much sure they're playing in the air, actually chasing bugs to feed on, but it's an extraordinary sight watching them. Or I go and take the dog, who seems to have gone to sleep, thankfully. I take him to the beechwoods near where I live, and the beauty of these beechwoods with these trees, which are perhaps at least 100 years old or older, extraordinary giants of living entities. You know, they're just extraordinary magical things, and I'm just silent and content to just stand in their presence and be with them for a while. So when we allow ourselves this kind of stillness and this simplicity and the contentment which I'm suggesting can arise in that kind of spaciousness, we come to experience another very important aspect of what basic Buddhist teaching, which is a sort of unconditional cherishing or caring, a kind of reaching out from the life within us to the life without us. A desire, it's a kind of warm feeling. It's a love that is reaching out, and in Buddhist terminology is called metta. And this is really the fundamental, necessary and sufficient Buddhist virtue that fuels and underpins Buddhist activism, I would suggest. We have to be in touch with this to really be able to move effectively and creatively. And metta is styled as being an immeasurable, because in its fullest sense, it's quite unconditional, it's universal, and it's directed to all living things and anything that is alive. And it's a very deep practice, but in a way, it's a very far-reaching one, but it's also quite a simple one, as I've been trying to sort of conjure up for us. But perhaps in trying to describe what's involved in it, it's easy to think of us, as it were, something coming from me out to you or other beings. And there's a sense in which then there's a sort of there's a separation. And I think there's a perspective which metta helps us to sort of sense into, which is that we're inseparably intertwined and interrelating and interaffecting at every level of our being. And as one of the well-known Buddhist ecologists, a man called David Loy, American, says, the most fundamental principle of ecology, the interdependence of living beings and systems, is a subset of the most fundamental principle of Buddhist philosophy, that nothing has self-existence because everything is dependent on other things. And it's even that language kind of conjures this notion that it's one, we're all inseparably, as it were, entwined with each other and interaffecting each other. But it kind of goes a bit further than that. It's one of realizing that actually that is just a manner of speaking, that we are much more of a one rather than a whole, just a collection of separate selves. I'm not going to dwell hugely on that, but Eisenstein, who I've referred to as four, is this talking about this story of separation, of domination and so forth, talks about this as the story of interbeing, as a way of trying to capture this flavor. He says, we want to move from a society of domination to one of participation, from one of conquest to co-creation, from extraction to regeneration, from harm to healing, and from separation to love. But there's one very important aspect of which that I think is critical to this experience of love, of metta, of loving kindness, and that is that it's lived out, it's embodied, it's enacted. Definitely running out of time here. Anyway, I'll keep pressing on. My point is that, as Sangharakshita has said, it's not just a question of developing this kind of emotion on a meditation cushion, important as that is, and as vitalizing as it can be. But it is that one's metta enters into our action and expresses itself in terms of acting for the benefit of others. And in a way, that's the litmus test, the hallmark of whether one's metta is really kind of finding its roots, as it were. So what is a truly human response to the climate and ecological crisis? Well, what do we do when what we love is in danger? What we want to protect. We want to do anything and everything we can to eliminate the danger and instead enhance the life that is in danger. And this is at the heart of what is expressed in the first and second precepts of loving kindness and of generosity. And there's one particular verse in the Dharmachari which I find helps to capture this flavor, which is the Dharmachari being a collection of sayings attributed to the Buddha. As the bee takes honey from flowers, leaving their color and fragrance unharmed, so should the sage live in the world. What that suggests to me is a life that is based on service and serving that upon which we survive. The difficulty with this is that very often traditional teachings in Buddhism, as David Loy points out, focuses on one's own peace of mind and the attainment of that. And consequently, social engagement remains a challenge for many Buddhists because it seems almost like a sideshow. So Buddhist teaching can very easily be seen as advocating withdrawing from the world, in effect, giving up on the world as a basket case, as beyond redemption. And this isn't a modern phenomenon. If you happen to be feeling this, it's something that goes back into the very guts of the history of Buddhism, and gets played out in the tussle between what has been called the Hinayana on the one hand and the Mahayana on the other. Two major developments in the historical path of Buddhism as it developed in the first 1,000 years of its history. This kind of tension between practicing for self-enlightenment or practicing for the sake and benefit of others. So this just brings me to the fourth aspect of this fourfold task, which is can be seen as a blueprint of a pathway or a middle way. It's actually the eightfold path itself and has 8 limbs. I'm not going to go into these in any detail, but it's interesting that Batchelor, in highlighting one way of interpreting this particular aspect of this fourfold task, goes to a parable that the Buddha tells when he's trying to illustrate the nature of this eightfold path. And the parable is one of a man who gets lost in an ancient forest and comes across a pathway which in itself seems to be very overgrown, and he follows it deep into the forest, and eventually it leads to a deserted city. And once he's discovered and explored the deserted city, he returns, finds his way back to the king of his country, and he exhorts the king to revivify and to restore the city to its former glory and its vibrancy. So what Batchelor is suggesting is that the Eightfold Path, and as it were, a very important dimension of this fourfold task, is setting about creating a world, a collective, collaborative adventure on the part of all of us in creating something that we can live in now, a world that actually is very different to the one that we find ourselves in. And one which emerges out of a perspective that we're all in this together. And that is extremely pertinent to living on a fragile planet whose boundaries are being threatened. So I'm going to move on now to just sharing with you a little bit of history around how we might be able to take some inspiration from examples of activism and activists that are out there, or have been out there. Activism can be defined as that vigorous and practical effort to bring about either political, economic, social, or environmental change, which is often directly emerging from inequality, discrimination, and exploitation. And its goal is to make changes which are perceived to be for the greater good and welfare of humanity. And when you look up activism in Wikipedia, you'll discover that there are over 100 examples listed, and they come in all sorts of sizes and shapes and colors. So a little bit overwhelming, actually, to try and get your head around it all. And they range from Esperanto on the one hand to the cooperative movement on the other. So I've just picked a few little examples just to share with you, but I'm not going to dwell on them. Historically, if you're talking to people in the world that I've been living in, they will often refer to Gandhi, who was integral to the push for Indian independence. They'll talk about Martin Luther King and John Lewis, who were really important in the American civil rights movements of the late 50s and 60s. And of course, they'll talk about Mandela, who's fought at the anti-apartheid. But they may also mention William Wilberforce, who was very active in the abolition of slavery. So it's not just a sort of 20th century phenomena. Or they may mention the Pankhursts, who were important in the UK suffragette movement for women's rights to vote. Coming more home recently, you might talk about the 60s peace movement, the Vietnam focus, particularly in the States, or something that I was much more involved in my early years, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. And then much more recently, we've had examples of gay rights and LGBTQ and women's rights movements and the Me Too and so forth. More pertinent to what our topic is tonight, there's all sorts of environmental movements out there, ranging from Earth Day, World Wildlife Fund, Friends of the Earth, and Greenpeace, just to mention a few. But more recently, perhaps, we're starting to see an evolution of some of these activists. I mean, in a way, all of these things are just sort of kind of replayings of certain themes again and again in different ways. But climate justice has become a big one recently. So War on Want and Black Lives Matter, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, and Just Stop Oil are all different kind of iterations, as it were, or examples of people trying to bring about a fairer, more just world, which is based around, to a large extent, the impact of climate and the ecological emergency, the effect that it has in all sorts of different ways on communities. And I've mentioned another one, which was The Economists. You may have come across a woman called Kate Raworth, who is at Oxford University, and she's come up with something called donut economics. And this is an attempt to try and completely revolutionize the whole way that economists think about the way that we organize our world of business and business activity. And she's having quite a lot of success. I'll provide the link for you to pursue, but it's very interesting what she's up to. Another one which is really taking off in a big way now is legal activism. So a lot of people putting time and energy into pursuing either trying to get governments to enact new laws. So the UK Climate and Ecological Bill is currently going through its third reading in Parliament. Whether it'll ever see the light of day, who knows? But it's you know, that's an attempt to change the law and then hold the. But then there are laws already which people are taking governments to court to try and uphold, and there are a number of different examples of that. One I just want to very briefly mention, which again is an attempt to change the nature of things globally, is something called Stop Ecocide International. And this is about trying to bring back something which was initially tabled when genocide was first made and put into international law. The ecocide, the deliberate trashing of the environment, should be something that was not allowed in international law, and that people could be brought to the international court for doing that. And again, that is beginning to hold some real traction. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, do pursue it, because I'll give you the link to it. So a huge number of different forms of activism. I was really, really quite surprised by just how many there were. And they range from building local community pressure through writing letters to newspapers, petitioning elected officials, political campaigning, door knocking, phone trees, to more obvious kinds of ways of perhaps being obstructive, like striking or road marches, legal rallies, even criminal damage, sit-ins, hunger strikes, and so on. Within the activist tradition, there's two, basically, there are three different, well, in a sense two, but then a sort of an attempt to try and bring the two together, two very kind of different approaches. One is what's called the structural movement, and there was a lot of time and energy went into this in the USA in the 50s and 60s. And this was about building really stable community-based institutions from the ground up, which took on local issues and gradually built momentum in that kind of way. I'll give you references to this later, but a really good example of that more recently is a woman called Jane McAlvey, who has an organization called Organizing for Power. And she talks about promoting what she calls supermajorities in places like educational institutions, schools, and in hospitals and other kinds of health institutions, where, you know, she says there's no point going on strike unless you have more than 90% of the people willing to go out. And if you have that kind of buy-in from the workforce, then you have a really strong negotiating position. And she has a very well oiled way of demonstrating how to go about to generating these supermajorities, as she calls them. The opposite approach to that is just taking advantage of unpredictable, disruptive uprisings, what's sometimes been in the literature called whirlwinds. And the most obvious example of this would be the Arab Springs, you know, the kind of attempts to overthrow various, I don't know what you call them really, governments in, and they sort of seem to almost come out of nowhere. They're, as I say, they're whirlwinds. They sort of just the Black Lives Matter thing with the George Floyd was a classic example of of one of these whirlwind moments where American police have been doing lots of really nasty things to black people forever. But there was something about what happened to George Floyd and the way that people got to witness that, which just suddenly lit the fuse and it just took off. And this particular approach is saying, well, you have to be ready to take advantage of that. I've got 10 minutes. Okay, so examples of Buddhist activists. This is something that actually is really quite interesting. There's a lot of people out there who've done all sorts of different things over the years. I mean, if we go back as far as Ashoka, then we're well back, you know, probably getting on for 2,000 years ago. But much more recently, there's this kind of a threefold tradition. There are Buddhists who just like to advocate and encourage and exhort and hold up through being sources of inspiration, a different way of engaging with the world. Then there are actually people who engage in what you might call creating movements of social reform or communities of practice. And there are a number of different examples of this. The Greystone Foundation in New York is an example. Thich Nhat Hanh's Order of Interbeing and the Plum Village Community of Engaged Buddhism is another one. Urgyen Sangharakshita's Triratna Buddhist Community is probably, arguably, another one too. And particularly through its activities in an independent charity called Karuna in the Dalit community, in particular in India. But there are other organizations which just basically just do good work, charitable relief, something called Buddhist Global Reliefs, initiated by Bhikkhu Bodhi, for example, something called the Korean Junkto Society. I probably haven't pronounced that right, but they work all over the world, just relieving poverty and distress in one way or another. And there are others too. So I was going to share with you an example of Greystone, but I've run out of time for that. So I'm just going to move on to my last bit, which I think probably is very much worth just touching on, which is to just return to my own particular form of activism, which is that of non-violent direct action and civil disobedience, and how I justify that as a Buddhist. And the answer is that I'm not very, very clear about this. It's you know, it's something that it's ongoing work. The thing is that civil disobedience and resistance is almost invariably disruptive. It's about confronting power, and that's usually in the form of governments. And as an ex-slave, a black man in the 19th century, who actually came to be nominated as the vice president of the US, Frederick Douglass, said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." So this kind of civil disobedience is really the equivalent of strike action. It's about material disruption, and it's about forcing governments to come to the negotiating table. And in the relation to climate and ecological crisis, about honouring their commitment to act. Certainly in relation to the UK government, they've made all sorts of commitments. They're even enshrined in law. But very often all they actually do is just posture. What happened at COP26 is a really good example of that. But then the question is, in that confrontation, in using power in that way, is that okay? Is it actually genuinely non-violent? Non-violence is something that Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Mandela are absolutely adamant about as being, you know, really important. At the same time, they were saying it's not about using brute strength. It's more about jujitsu. It's more about using one's opponent's power against them. So in activist circles, this is very much about trying to use confrontation in a way which presents them with a dilemma. so what we come back to, well, you know, where does that get you? Well, the thing is that you're trying to actually change public opinion. And it seems that it's possible to do this with actually really quite a small number of activists. There seems to be quite a lot of social science. I've given you the references to this to suggest that we only need 3.5% of the population to be actively upstanding to stand a chance of 50%, a 50% chance of having some success. But nevertheless, disruption is playing with fire. It's deliberately and inevitably polarizing. It provokes reactivity. And very often the intention is to draw the media's attention to what you're doing because of what one's doing. You know, if you're sitting in the road saying insulate Britain, you want people to be thinking about insulating Britain. But actually, very often they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about what a tosser you are for sitting in the road and disrupting their life. And of course, the right-wing media love to paint one in that light and will say, you know, how selfish you are and so forth. So the question is this really in accord with unconditional caring and cherishing? And one of the real dangers that one can fall into as an activist is to start shaming and blaming and othering and making the others the enemy and kind of getting into this fight mentality of, you know, us and them, and we've got to win and they've got to lose. And that's just that kind of mindset, which is very, very tempting to fall into, and one which is very necessary to avoid. But one can't get away from the fact that disruption is inevitably breaking the second precept by taking what is not freely given. In other words, other people's time, energy, and opportunity. And they have no choice in just being collateral damage in the action. So whilst the positive version of what one might be doing is that of trying to serve them, nevertheless, the fact is, you know, we are taking something away from them. So I'm just going to leave you with this parable that comes from the White Lotus Sutra, which is something which was written down in a long time after the Buddha, but portrays the Buddha as a figure trying to evacuate a burning house that has lots of children, his children in it. And the question that is posed to him is, because the children don't want to leave this house, they're much too interested in enjoying what they're up to, is how do you get people out of a burning house when they won't listen to you? Now, the Buddha in the parable entices his children out to safety with promises. And in the language of Mahayana Buddhism, what he is demonstrating is what's termed as employing skillful means. So, yeah, I mean, it just raises the question for people like myself, you know, am I genuinely engaged in skillful means or not? And there isn't a very cut and dried answer to that. But nevertheless, what does seem to be very obvious is that our house is burning down, and I have to find a way of getting us all out of it, because it's not just the house, it's actually everything is threatened. Okay, just to sort of conclude, I hope I've managed to share with you something of the reasons why I feel that as a practicing Buddhist, what I'm doing kind of makes sense. Yeah, you may not agree with it, or you may think there are all sorts of questions which get raised by what I've shared with you. And of course, that's entirely understandable. But I mean, what I've tried to share with you is as what has spoken to me and sustains me in doing what I do, and will continue to do for a while yet. And in the end, whether it can be demonstratively shown to make a difference or not isn't really the point as far as I'm concerned. what's important, what the real point, I mean, as much as I would like it to be quite self-evidently making a difference, the real point is I need to just be authentic and true to myself in what I believe. And I hope I'm doing that I'm not in some way or other, kidding myself. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention and time, and I'll leave it there.